In the year 1854, a 19-year-old Irish boy named Robert Hart left his hometown in Ulster and boarded a ship bound for China. After an arduous 2-month voyage, Hart arrived in Hong Kong to start a new life as a trainee interpreter. 40 years later, Robert Hart was in charge of the tax system across the entire Chinese Empire and was trusted by the Chinese Mandarins as one of their own. Robert Hart's life is an unpredictable tale of adventure, ambition, and of devotion to a cause. His achievements are numerous, from gaining the trust of top Chinese Mandarins to signing peace treaties to the fundamental transformation of the Chinese state. This is the story of Robert Hart, the Irish Mandarin. Robert Hart was born in 1835 in Portadown, Ulster, Ireland. The eldest of 12 children, Hart showed high intelligence from childhood, and at the age of only 15, he earned a scholarship to study at Queen's College, Belfast. He passed his bachelor's degree at the age of 18 and would have continued to study a master's degree were he not nominated by Queen's College for consular service as an interpreter in China. Attracted by a sense of adventure and a generous annual pay of £200, Hart left for China when he was only 19 years old. For the next 6 years, Hart worked as an interpreter for British diplomats in Hong Kong, Ningbo, and Guangzhou. Yet Hart was unsatisfied with simply being an interpreter, and he sought more. So, in the year 1859, he unexpectedly resigned from his post as an interpreter in order to join the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs. The Maritime Customs was a department staffed by both Chinese and foreigners which aimed to tax the trade between China and the outside world. It was also a very new department, having only been established a few years earlier. After the British had defeated the Qing dynasty in the First Opium War, they pressured the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. The treaty's terms greatly favoured the British, forcing the Qing to not only open up 5 treaty ports to trade with Britain, but also forced the Qing to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British as a colony. In the early years, trade at these treaty ports was considered disappointing by the British, with the exception of Shanghai. Yet Shanghai was far from peaceful. In 1853, an anti-government rebel group called the Small Sword Society stormed Shanghai and fought with the Qing authorities for control of the city. The rebels were victorious, and the Qing authorities present in Shanghai were either slaughtered by the rebels or fled the city. The Small Sword Society aimed to overthrow the Qing government, but they had no issue with the small number of wealthy foreign residents who were already living and trading in Shanghai. Therefore, the rebels made a pact with the expats, guaranteeing them safety and the freedom to continue trading as before. During the assault on the Qing government offices in Shanghai, the old customs house, which had taxed the foreign trade in Shanghai, had been destroyed. With the old department no longer functioning, in 1854 the British made an understanding with the Qing government to open a new customs department that would be modelled on the British tax regime. The establishment of the treaty ports was part of the British strategy to force China to open up its vast and lucrative market to foreign trade. This new maritime customs department helped legitimise and regulate this trade, ensuring that China's market would remain open to the outside world. Yet the Qing dynasty would also benefit from this new institution. By taxing the foreign trade through the maritime customs, the Qing government could gain vital, much-needed revenue. It could use these funds to reform its government and to maintain social stability, helping to prevent further disruptive rebellions. The Qing army eventually defeated the Small Sword Society in 1855 and took back Shanghai. But the new Maritime Customs Department, which had been created during the crisis, was to remain in operation for the next 100 years. The Maritime Customs was modelled on its British counterpart and operated in much the same way, and yet it was also unique and innovative on many other levels. It was staffed by individuals from an array of different Western nations, as well as local Chinese talent, making it a truly diverse institution. The diversity of the staff was not only requested by the Qing state, but also helped to placate the fears of other Western nations that the British were alone gaining too much control over the Chinese bureaucracy. Prior to the founding of the League of Nations in 1920, the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service was the only internationally staffed civil service in the world. In 1873, the Chinese government commissioned an Austrian tailor, C.M. Frank, to produce the uniforms for the customs officers. The jacket was made of dark navy wool with gold embroidery around the cuffs and the collar. The trousers were also made of wool. Under the jacket, the officer would wear a white vest, and on their head, a cocked hat made of beaver felt, which was decorated with gold bullion. Additionally, a sword frog, which was for holding swords, would have been fastened to their waist. Robert Hart joined the Maritime Customs only 5 years after it had been established. From the outset, Hart was noted for his diligent work ethic and perfect Chinese, earning him the respect of both the foreign and Chinese staff in the Maritime Customs. The Maritime Customs was headed by an Inspector General, yet the first Inspector General, Horatio Nelson Ley, was forced to resign in 1863 in the wake of a scandal which came to be known as the Ley-Osborne Flotilla Incident. Ley had facilitated the sale of British warships to the Qing government, which the Qing intended to use to quash the Taiping Rebellion, an internal insurrection which had gained control of large parts of the centre of China. Ley had told the British Royal Navy Admiral Sherard Osborne that he could command the fleet himself, but when the ships arrived, the Qing insisted that local Chinese officers should take charge. Osborne refused to take orders from the Chinese and subsequently resigned from his post. The fleet was sent back to England without a single shot having been fired. Because of his failure to organise in advance who should command the fleet, Ley was forced out of the Maritime Customs by the Zhongli Yamen. The Zhongli Yamen was the department which handled international relations during the Qing dynasty, and it was also the department which had the final say on who could work at the Maritime Customs. In recognition of his great work, it was Hart who was appointed as Ley's replacement. Assuming his post at the age of only 29, Hart remained as the Inspector General of the Maritime Customs for over 40 years, until the year 1908. Throughout Hart's tenure, the scale and scope of the Maritime Customs was constantly increasing. In the 1870s, the Maritime Customs began constructing lighthouses along the entire stretch of the Chinese coastline. By 1892, over 100 lighthouses had been built. The light emitted from these new lighthouses would help trade ships navigate China's rocky coast, helping to further increase international trade in China. Moreover, the number of customs houses increased exponentially during Hart's tenure, rising from a couple on China's coast when he began to over 50 across the entire empire when he left. Customs houses had even been opened in the remote and underdeveloped western reaches of the Chinese Empire, including Tibet and Xinjiang. The customs house in Shanghai, which was both the first and the most important customs house, was upgraded multiple times. The first iteration was built in a traditional Chinese temple style, similar to the Zhongli Yamen. In stark contrast, the second iteration has a distinctly British Tudor style. The third and final iteration is fitted on top with a giant clock. This clock was built in Britain and modelled off Big Ben. At its height, the Maritime Customs Service employed over 20,000 staff and collected roughly 1/3 of the total revenue available to the Qing government. Western governments supported the maritime customs operations because a large portion of the revenue collected was redirected back to them in the form of loan repayments. Having built up trust with both the Qing government and the Western colonial powers, Hart was able to serve as an intermediary between the two, helping them communicate with each other and resolve their differences. After a British official by the name Augustus Raymond Margery was murdered by locals in southwest China in 1875, Hart is credited with cooling the tensions between Britain and China and convincing the two nations to resolve the matter by signing the Chifu Convention. A quarter of a century later, when the Eight-Nation Alliance of colonial powers were demanding exorbitant compensation from China for the Boxer Rebellion, Hart assisted the Zhongli Yamen in negotiating terms which the Qing could accept. Whilst these two treaties are regarded as unequal treaties forcibly imposed on China by the West, Hart's ability to convince the aggressors to reduce the severity of their demands was greatly appreciated by the Qing. Perhaps not surprisingly, staff at the Zhongli Yamen affectionately referred to Hart as 我们的赫德, meaning our boy Hart. Realising his diplomatic ability, in 1885 Hart was asked by the British government to become the Minister Plenipotentiary in Beijing, essentially Britain's head ambassador in China. Yet Hart's response was to decline, choosing instead to focus on his work at the Maritime Customs. Nevertheless, the British Crown did show their appreciation to Hart by granting him a baronetage in 1893. This honorific title ranks below a baron but above a knight. Whilst Hart received universal praise for his achievements, those who worked under him felt that he was an egotistic man who operated in an autocratic style. Yet Hart himself believed that it was his personal life that was his biggest failure. In the early 1860s, Hart had 3 illegitimate children with a Chinese prostitute. Whilst he did provide funds for them to have a relatively decent life, he kept their existence secret from those around him. Concerned with his lack of a respectable British wife, Hart's aunt arranged his marriage to Hester Jane Breddon in 1866 during his first trip back home. Hart also kept his illegitimate children a secret from Hester. Robert took Hester with him when he returned to Beijing, but he was so devoted to his work that he barely spoke to her. Worse, he rarely found any time at all for his 3 legitimate children that he had with Hester. Hester and their 3 children returned to Britain in 1876, and save for a brief reunion in Britain in 1878, Robert Hart's only communication with his family for the next several decades would be conducted through letters. Writing to his agent in London in the early 20th century, Hart admitted that he had been a neglectful father, but justified it by saying he felt that ultimately China was his priority. Given how neglectful Hart had been, it is not surprising that when his 2 eldest children travelled to Beijing to meet their father for the first time in over a decade in the 1890s, they didn't get along. In 1908, Hart took leave to return to England for his 3rd and what would ultimately be his final time. Due to his poor health, Hart was unable to return to China, and 3 years later, on the 20th of September 1911, he passed away in Buckinghamshire at the age of 76. A mere 10 days after his death, the Wuchang Uprising occurred, which signalled the beginning of the end of the Qing dynasty. Throughout his time in China, Hart was straddled between 2 worlds, between Britain and China, with loyalties to both. Yet, although Hart had great appreciation and affection for Chinese culture, ultimately he believed in the superiority of British culture. Hence, in order to help China, Hart believed that he needed to transplant the modern British customs system onto the antiquated Chinese state. Yet, what is most fascinating about Hart is not that he had the incredible ability to create the maritime customs system, but that he managed to gain the praise from both the Qing government and the British government whilst he did it. Thanks for watching this documentary. If you want to continue exploring Chinese history, make sure that you are subscribed to Bygone China and that you check out the other videos on this channel.